Well, good evening. Welcome to Propaganda Girls with Lisa Rogak. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education here at the International Spy Museum. Thank you so much for joining us. And tonight, Lisa will discuss her latest book, Propaganda Girls. We're all crazy about this cover. Propaganda Girls, The Secret War of the Women in the OSS. Now, Lisa is a New York Times bestselling author of more than 40 books. This takes my breath away. They have been published in more than 24 languages. Her books, Barack Obama in His Own Words, and Angry Optimist, The Life and Times of Jon Stewart, hit the New York Times bestseller list. Haunted Heart, The Life and Times of Stephen King, was nominated for both the Edgar and Anthony Awards. Her focus on writing exceptional nonfiction and passion for telling biographical stories led her to the extraordinary women she writes about in Propaganda Girls. And I was really delighted when I learned about this book to see the connections between the Spy Museum's content and this book. Betty MacDonald, who's featured in the book, had remarried and had long been known as Betty McIntosh when we hosted her for a program about the OSS here at Spy Museum in May of 2004. And it was an honor to host her and have her here. And then Marlene Dietrich, probably well known to most of you. Marlene Dietrich is featured in our propaganda exhibit in our covert action gallery. And that's where we discuss the German heartstrings that Marlene pulled singing Lily Marlene in German. All right, Barbara Lauwers is also featured right near Marlene Dietrich in our galleries. And it's so fun. It says, pull here to meet a clever woman. And the clever woman you meet is Barbara. And we feature one of her wartime operations, the League of Lonely Women. And it encouraged German soldiers to believe that their mothers, sisters, and sweethearts might not be demurely tending home and hearth while they were away fighting. So Lisa is going to do a presentation about some of these different women, reading some excerpts from her book, and then after that, we will turn to your questions. So enough from me, over to you, Lisa Rogak.
Hi. So I'm going to start by reading the intro to the book because that's the best way to give you a feel for what the book is about and who these women actually were. During the last brutal 18 months of World War II, American troops in the European and Far East theaters began to notice a significant uptick in the number of Axis soldiers and collaborators who were surrendering peacefully and willingly to the Allies. Defeated German and Japanese troops stumbled across enemy lines in Europe and Asia with one hand thrust in the air, waving a piece of paper with the other. In some cases, it was a tattered scrap of fabric fashioned into the globally recognized white flag of surrender. But many of the war-weary soldiers brandished leaflets, newspapers, and letters that had served as their personal breaking points, convincing them that theirs was a war that was no longer worth fighting for. One half-starved German even handed over a couple of sheets of rough toilet paper with Hitler's face printed on it as his ticket out of the war. The Allied Welcoming Committee patted down the enemy soldiers before sending them on to intelligence officers, followed by the first good meal they'd had in months. They tossed the well-creased, sweat-stained papers into the burn pile, along with their enemies' threadbare uniforms. Neither the Allied nor Axis soldiers realized it, but many of the broadsides, pamphlets, and other documents that the defectors presented in surrender came from a common source. What's more, they were totally fake. A secret brand of propaganda produced by a small group of women who spent the last years of the war conjuring up lies, stories, and rumors with the sole aim to break the morale of Axis soldiers. These women worked in the European theater, across enemy lines in occupied China, and in Washington, D.C., and together and separately they forged letters and quote-unquote official military orders. They wrote and produced entire newspapers, scripted radio broadcasts and songs, and even developed rumors for undercover spies and double agents to spread to the enemy. And outside of a small group of spies, no one knew they existed. The four women of propaganda girls, Elizabeth Betty MacDonald, Jane Smith-Hutton, Barbara Zuzka Lauwers, and celebrated German-American actress Marlene Dietrich, worked for General Wild Bill Donovan's Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS, the precursor of today's CIA. Their department, the Morale Operations Branch, or MO as it was known, was in charge of producing black propaganda, which was defined as any leaflet, poster, radio broadcast, or other public or private media that appeared to come from within the enemy country, either from a resistance movement or from disgruntled soldiers and civilians. In essence, black propaganda was a series of believable lies designed to cause the enemy soldiers to lose heart and ultimately surrender. But it was also aimed at occupied populations and soldiers captured for cheap labor, to encourage them to rise up against their oppressors and join the winning side. Donovan, who had studied Nazi black propaganda, knew how effective these tactics could be. Subtly planned rumor and propaganda can subvert people from allegiance to their own country, he said. It is essentially a weapon of exploitation, and if it's successful, can be more effective than a shooting war. While officers in other departments refused to hire women, Donovan specifically searched them out when he began to staff his new MO branch, as he believed they would excel at creating subversive materials. General Donovan believed that we could do things that the men couldn't, Betty said years later. We were able to think of a lot of gossipy things to do for MO that men never would have thought of. I don't want to brag, but women can hurt people better, maybe, than men could think of. Women seem to have a feeling for how to really fool people. So this is a picture of Zuzka, Barbara Lauwers, and the man who she worked very closely alongside was actually the esteemed, he would go on to become the esteemed cartoonist at the New Yorker. His name was Saul Steinberg. He's the one who created that infamous New York cartoon where New York was this big and the rest of the country was this big. So they worked together in the Rome office, and they are the ones who came up with the idea for the toilet paper. When they first started working together, Zuzka and Steinberg became fast friends. Together, they came up with an idea to make toilet paper featuring Adolf Hitler's face. The Rome MO office had access to a neighborhood print shop, but this project had to look crude and amateurish. There. This project had to look crude and amateurish, like a civilian could have created it, or a disgruntled soldier who had secretly turned against the Nazis. Steinberg carved out a picture of Hitler on a piece of linoleum with the words, does anybody know German? Diese Seite, which is German for use this side. They hand-printed a number of rolls and gave them to OSS agents to distribute in German jeeps and latrines. This is the perfect segue to another project that Betty created when she was stationed in Delhi. And again, a lot of the propaganda that was created had to look like it came from the resistance or the underground or disgruntled civilians, and also given that it was wartime, high-quality materials were not readily available, if at all. In Delhi, in addition to creating propaganda aimed at the Japanese military, Betty and her colleagues also had to craft propaganda aimed at civilians who lived in regions that were occupied by the Japanese military, including China, Burma, and Indonesia. Just as Zuzka had to get creative with a linoleum shard to create toilet paper with Hitler's face on it, Betty also had to improvise out in the field. One of her projects was a leaflet directed at Indonesians, urging them to resist their Japanese occupiers and to perform acts of sabotage against them. Previous operations had distributed pamphlets from airdrops, but Betty didn't want to go this route because it would be clear that the leaflets came from an Allied plane. The British equivalent of MO was also stationed in Delhi and occasionally cooperated with the Americans on operations and supplies. Betty had recently become friendly with a man in the British Navy, and she asked him to help her by taking the leaflets with him by submarine and distributing them by essentially floating them into the country. He agreed to the operation, but how to waterproof the leaflets? Balloons? No good, they were obviously in short supply. But condoms weren't. Betty asked the infirmary for 500 condoms, and after a lot of questions and some raised eyebrows, they handed them over. It was all hands on deck to inflate the condoms and slip in the propaganda, along with a much-prized anti-malarial pill as an added inducement. And before the British soldier took off in the submarine, Betty and a couple of colleagues were about halfway through the project when "Attention!" suddenly bounced off the cinder block walls, and in walked General Donovan. He'd long made a habit of visiting far-flung OSS outposts to show his support and liked to make surprise visits. He walked into the room just as Betty had her mouth around the opened end of a condom. He took one look at us and what we were doing, smiled very faintly, then turned and left, said Betty. Donovan took it in stride. After all, he had created his own monster by hiring people for MO who were kind of a ragtag bunch and not commonly known for saluting when a higher-up walked into the room. Since Betty didn't enlist in the military when she joined the OSS, she was technically a civilian. However, she did have an army uniform without insignia to wear in case she was captured. Then they'd have to treat me as a prisoner of war, she said. In fact, Betty's lackadaisical attitude towards anything military got a colleague in trouble when he was promoted to sergeant, and he asked her to sew on his insignia. I sewed them on upside down because I thought they'd look better that way, and besides, that's the way the British did it, he said. But he got demoted for it. Before Marlene became involved in the OSS, she traveled extensively on USO tours, and she also made a point to visit field hospitals whenever she could. She also liked to cross over in enemy lines back into Germany. She took a lot of risks. She was ballsy, and Donovan definitely noticed. When she was in New York, and Donovan paid her a visit, he had come up with an idea for a new clandestine program called the MUSAC program that was gearing up in plain sight, right in Times Square. He explained that he wanted to expand Soldatensender West, which was the British equivalent, enhancing the musical selections by broadcasting popular American songs recorded by German singers in their native language. He figured this would help twist the heartstrings of German civilians and soldiers alike, bringing them one step closer to acknowledging the futility of continuing to fight an unwinnable war. And in his opinion, there was no better performer to accomplish this than Marlene Dietrich. and Donovan asked her to contribute a total of 12 songs to the project, and she quickly agreed. Noted German composer Kurt Weill, who wrote the music for the Threepenny Opera, orchestrated and arranged the OSS songs to suit the German mood and temperament, and his wife, singer Lottie Lenya, would actually record several songs on the project. Many of the songs had no propaganda content, but were intended solely to attract listeners to the news segments. Others had a nostalgic appeal designed to promote more weariness and defection. I want to point out also that morale operations tends to be introduced towards the end of the war when it's clear one side is clearly going to lose. And so Emma wasn't really introduced until early in 1944. So about the songs. Others were hard-hitting satirical songs attacking Nazi leaders, relating to the discomforts and disillusionment of war. Marlene loved the project, and she was well aware there was a real risk in beaming her sonorous alto directly into her war-weary native country. Some Germans viewed her as a traitor. Indeed, in the thin-walled, bombed-out tenements of Berlin and Dresden, neighbors who continued to toe the Nazi party line, despite mounting evidence that the German army was in retreat, were all too willing to turn in their neighbors to the local Gestapo. But many Germans missed her voice. After all, she was the country's biggest export before the war. For many disgruntled Germans, hearing the sound of Marlene's voice, even at low volume, on a transistor radio pressed against the head and with a blanket tightly tucked in to muffle any residual sounds, was worth the risk. Besides, there was no other American singer who had the essential ingredient. "I am German, and I understand the Germans," she affirmed. Just like Jane, who had spent years along the Japanese, she knew best how to hurt them and what would push their buttons. Marlene's friend, Ernest Hemingway, who called her the Kraut, agreed. Even if she had nothing else but her voice, she could break hearts with it, he said. So you heard a snippet of Lily Marlene. She recorded 12, this album came out, was reissued, I think in 1951 or 1952, when Mitch Miller, the band leader and song leader, what was his TV show? Follow the Bouncing Ball is what I'm remembering now. But he was head of research and development at RCA, and he wanted to bring Marlene back. And so he suggested that she make a record of songs that she recorded for the OSS. And she said, no, it was too painful of a time. She couldn't possibly record them. But Mitch worked on her for a long time, and she finally relented. She wanted to originally use the original tapes, tapes that the OSS had made, except I don't think the OSS was going to let her, which is why Mitch pressed her to record them. And so she recorded the session. The recording session was held in the middle of Times Square. Nobody knew about it. The musicians didn't know about it. They broke every copyright law in existence because they used the song without getting permission. And so on the record, there were, fast forward to creating the record, they got copyright permission this time. But the most surprising and amusing songs on the album was from the musical Oklahoma, the Surrey with the Fringe on Top. And she sings it in German. It's a little different from Lily Marlene. So this is Jane Smith-Hutton on the far left. She is an unusual woman. I want to talk about a little about how I picked the women for my book. I wanted 4 women in geographically different areas, in Europe, in the Asian CBI theater, and I also wanted a woman in DC, because all of the books that I've ever read about World War II, and then later as I was researching the book, the OSS, no one spoke about what it was like to work in DC at OSS headquarters. And so the criteria for picking the women overall was that there had to be enough information out there on them that I could create a quarter of a book about them. And a lot of, like Betty, she had written a couple of books, she had written a lot of articles, and she was interviewed quite frequently on her experience in the OSS later on, I think starting in the 90s and early 2000s. Marlene, there were entire books written about her war experience. And Zuzka had also written a lot about her experience. But they were all based overseas. And so when I started to look for a woman who was based in DC, pickings were pretty slim. But I used Betty as a resource. Actually, one of her books about women spies, I can't remember the name of it right now. Sisterhood of Spies, thank you, yes. So she had interviewed Jane for her book, and I think there was a whole chapter on her in the book. And I thought, oh, this is an interesting woman, because not only was she part of the OSS in the MO department, but she was actually married to a naval attaché based in, they were stationed in Asia, and they were actually in Tokyo when Pearl Harbor occurred. And they were living in the embassy, and they essentially were held hostage for over 6 months by, and I wanted to, again, in writing the book, I wanted to really focus on what drove these women towards wanting to join the OSS. Betty was living in Honolulu as a newspaper reporter. She covered Pearl Harbor, and she was really frustrated because they wouldn't let her. She was a women's reporter, and they wouldn't let her close to the scene. And Jane spent basically 6 or 7 months in captivity in Tokyo in the embassy. And so I heard that, and I said, that's why she's my DC woman. So here, another issue that the women regularly encountered was that they would put in for promotions. They were doing twice the work of the men in their division, dancing backwards on high heels, and they kept getting turned down over and over again for promotions. And so what I'm going to read to you now is this. Obviously, Jane was participating in this painting class. She spoke Japanese. One of the requirements for recruitment into MO and other parts of the OSS was that you had to speak at least one foreign language. Zuzka spoke 5. Betty spoke Japanese, and so did Jane, because she was really interested in pursuing Japanese culture. And so I think this is from a painting class in Tokyo, maybe around 1938 or 39. But Jane, who was based in the DC office, she was perennially discouraged by the lack of promotion, and this is the path that she took. And this is in in the fall of 1944. Jane decided that it was high time that she be promoted. After all, like Betty and Zuzka, she was often doing twice the work of her male colleagues and getting paid significantly less. She applied for an upgrade from Project Specialist CAF 7, which paid $2,600 a year, to Project Specialist CAF 9 with a salary of $3,200. It wasn't much, but it would provide confirmation that what she was doing was valuable. The required written recommendations she collected from co-workers were glowing. She holds a very responsible position and is one of the most valuable of our staff members. The requested increase in salary is well-deserved, said one. She is one of the most well-informed individuals on conditions in Japan who we have on our staff, said another. But her request for a promotion was turned down. The excuse was that she lacked sufficient work experience. Jane must have raised enough of a stink at her rejection that Edna Stonecipher, who was acting chief of the OSS Employment Division, wrote a letter asking the commission to reconsider the decision. It is felt that she warrants the commission's approval due to her unique qualifications. She is highly skilled in handling the intricate problems involved, and she is the best available qualified candidate for the position. 10 days later, the request was again rejected. Jane was outraged. She applied one more time, and whether it was due to her stubbornness or perhaps some money being reallocated from one budget to another, but on January 1st, 1945, she was promoted to the level of Project Specialist CAF 9 at a new yearly salary of $3,200 plus overtime, though she kept the same title of assistant to the head of the Japan desk. Jane was pleased, but perturbed that it took several tries to get promoted. Job descriptions at Emma were very fluid due to the constant flow of new projects and tasks that the staffers encountered on a daily basis. Besides, everybody was so flat out with work that nobody really noticed or cared what your title was, or if you just gave yourself a new one. So after she was promoted, Jane simply began to refer to herself as Chief Japan MO. After all, that's what black propaganda was, telling believable lies, and Jane was a very good student. Thank you. Now, questions. Time for questions.
Do you know how many women worked for the OSS?
Yes, but it's buried in the book somewhere. You have to buy the book to find out the number.
So we know that women who could speak a variety of languages were helpful. Did the OSS try to find women with experience in the parts of the world they would be involved in?
Not exactly. One of the derogatory nicknames for the OSS was "oh so social," because they Bill liked to recruit from high society, women who were educated, women who went to through the finishing schools, because they knew they would know how to conduct themselves as spies. And it was also, there was a very good chance that they could speak a second and third, maybe fourth language. So they were overwhelmingly white. I mean, I think they were all white. Back then, that was how it was. And so I think as Donovan did say, they were a real ragtag bunch otherwise, and they were not well. Jane came from a military family, so she was very used to, military protocol, but the rest, they were definitely on the opposite end of the spectrum.
So we've got, we did have one of our brilliant audience members online. You guys are brilliant too. But someone online said there were about 4,000 women in the
great,
OSS. They were probably consulting the book. What feedback do we have from the Germans and others how effective the Allied efforts of demoralization were towards the end of the war?
It's not like market research. You can't send out a survey and say, okay, how many people surrendered as a result of this, except for one exception. One project that Zuzka came up with, they were able to definitely determine that 600 POWs, Czech POWs, or not POWs, they were working for the Germans in a camp as slave labor, basically. And she sent out she actually created a pamphlet, but also wrote it as a script, and it was broadcast over the airwaves. My fellow Czech citizens, leave this German yoke of shame behind and surrender. And so they were able, and they were holding the pamphlet when they surrendered, and or they also said that they had heard the talk, the speech on over the radio, and so they were able to determine definitely that 600 people surrendered, but that was also a reason it was called MO Blues, because you couldn't really get any specific feedback on what you were doing. It was like you were throwing pamphlets and propaganda out into the ether, and you never knew how it was pulling. And that's the reason that Saul Steinberg left MO, because he just couldn't stand not having any tangible feedback as to whether his work was effective or not.
Right. I'm not trying to hog this microphone, but they keep coming online. They're very good. So, did the Germans eventually forgive Marlene Dietrich?
Did the Germans ever really forgive themselves? I didn't delve into that. She did appear in the movie Judgment at Nuremberg in the role of a Nazi woman who, it's in the book. I mean, she had trouble reciting one of her lines, which was, "We didn't know anything about it." And Spencer Tracy had to pull her aside and say, you have to say it like you believe it. And I think it took 10 or 20 takes, something like that. But she finally said it. But she never lived in. Did she live in Germany again? I don't know if she did. I don't think she did. So maybe that's the answer. Long-winded answer to your question.
Did any of the women continue with the OSS and then its following organization, the CIA, after the war?
Betty did.
And what were their roles,
I don't know. In fact, if I ever were to write on this subject again, I would write a book about Betty and the CIA, because she never talked about that. She, after the war, she married
McIntosh. She liked her Scotsman.
Yes.
MacDonald and then McIntosh.
Yes, I'm messing it up with Zuzka, who had 3 marriages. I mean, the war was not great for marriages. And so, but Betty was the only one who went on to work for the CIA, and she worked in Japan. She was undercover as a children's author. I think that's what got her into her position. But I think her husband had died, and she was depressed, and one of her former colleagues. It wasn't Saul Steinberg because he was no longer in the picture, but she says, you got to get working again. And so she joined up with the CIA, and she worked there for the rest of her career.
Thank you. Good evening.
Hi.
So out of 4,000 women, you chose 4.
Yes.
Were there any others that you were considering that were runners up that didn't make the cutting room floor, so to speak?
I spent months on this. I had to pull about 30 different personnel files from the OSS archives, and that also helped me to decide. Again, I had the most trouble finding a woman who was based in DC, and I came close with, I'm going to ditz on her name now, but her, just the evidence, the literature, the research, the background did not exist. And if I did pick one of these other women, it would have been, I could have done a composite. I could have done, profiled maybe 3 or 4 women in the at OSS headquarters, but it would have just been, it would have been very thin. I needed each woman, each of the 4 women, to pull their equal weight in the book, even though Marlene kept stealing the show, of course. But yes, thank you.
Okay. Our audience I love them. They're giving me extra info about when Marlene went to Germany.
Yay.
So not a question. So ultimately, last question, what inspired you to write the book?
Oh, yay. Okay. Well, one of the 40 books I've written, actually I did 3 of them, on military working dogs. And the first one was Dogs of War, and it was a crash book. I wrote it maybe in a month, and I could not possibly do that again. But it was after Osama bin Laden was killed, and it was discovered that there was a military working dog on the mission. And everybody wanted to know about military working dogs. So I get a call from my editor saying, what are you doing for the next month? Because in publishing, first advantage, if you're first out of the gate with a book everybody wants to read, that's the one that's going to sell both when it comes out and years later. And I said, I have a month free. What are you going to pay me? So I did the book, and then I did a couple of other books on dogs who serve, and there was another one. They all meld together. But while I was doing the research on the military working dog books, I'm such a broad reader. I want to read as much as possible, even if it's only tangentially related to the subject. And so I found out about either Betty or MO, and I thought, ooh, this sounds really interesting. So then I go off on another tangent, and I see, women were in this. And then is there another book on them? Okay, these other women, Betty wrote a book, and so on and so on. And I said, okay, let me put together a proposal. I put together a proposal, and my editor at the time and the publisher at the time, who were both men, said, this will never sell. And so that was back in 2018. So I said, okay, something else will come along. I put it in a drawer. And then this imprint ended up closing down right at the beginning of COVID. And I was working on, I think, I wrote a book on Alex Trebek. It wasn't in a month, it was 6 months, but still. So I finished that book up for production. That got scheduled. And the editor, a woman in her 30s, asked, what do you want to do next? What are you thinking of? And I said, well, I have this proposal, 100-page proposal, and a draw about these 4 women who created propaganda during the war. But your predecessors both turned thumbs down. And she says, send it to me. And I sent it to her. And 2 days later, she says, I want to buy this. And I said, oh, thank you. So that's how the book came about. Publishing is never straightforward. It's even less straightforward now. And it's very convoluted. And I still don't understand it. But that's how this book came about. But again, if Betty's CIA files were ever to be made public, that would be just so fascinating. I would love to. That's the one exception I'd make to writing another biography.
Come back and write that.
Yes.
Well, she really enjoyed, because she lived to over 100.
She was 100, yes.
And so there would always be an article in the Washington Post every year around her birthday, and she really celebrated her life at the end. So I think she had a wonderful experience.
And didn't she live in a retirement community that was filled with retired CIA?
It's easy to find around here.
Yeah, of course.
I think she was out in McLean,
Yeah.
That rings a bell. Well, Lisa, this has been so interesting, so great of you to share with us your research and your passion. And we have lots of other very cool programs coming up if you'll check out our website. We'd love to see you around, everyone. So enjoy Juneteenth.
All right. Yes. Thank you. Thank you.